If you're listening to this, you may drift off before the end. So before you do, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Before we start, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, close your eyes. Just relax, take a deep breath, and let everything go. Good night. Now we can begin. The dream was always the same. I stood at the edge of a quiet street, wrapped in the soft glow of flickering streetlights. The pavement beneath my feet stretched endlessly in both directions, vanishing into the fog that coiled like living smoke. A row of houses lined the street, silent, identical, their windows dark, their doors closed, no signs of life. No distant hum of traffic, no wind stirring the trees, only silence. I had been here before. I had walked these same streets, traced the same path beneath the dim orange glow. And yet I never reached the end. It wasn't unpleasant. It wasn't frightening. It simply was. I started forward, my footsteps muffled by the strange stillness that clung to the air. The pavement felt solid, but the world around me felt less so, as if it were made of something thinner than reality. I could feel it pressing at the edges of my senses, waiting for me to notice. I never did, not until last night. Because last night, someone else was there. I had turned a corner, expecting the same empty houses, the same unmoving streetlights. But instead, I saw a figure, standing perfectly still, watching me, not a shadow, not a trick of the fog. A person. The moment stretched long and thin, my breath shallow in my chest. I wanted to speak, to ask if they had been here before too, if they knew what this place was. But before I could form the words, they moved, not toward me, not away, just closer, a single step. Then, softly, too softly, they spoke. "You're not supposed to be here yet." The words settled into the air, thick with something I couldn't name. I took a step back. The figure did not move again. The fog swirled, shifting as if the street itself was exhaling, and then I woke up. Lying in my bed, heart steady, breath even, but something had changed. The silence in my room was different now. Not just absence of sound, but a presence of something else, a feeling, like someone had been watching me, like someone was still watching. And when I glanced at the clock on my nightstand, I noticed something strange. The numbers weren't moving, frozen at 3:33, as if time had stopped the moment I woke up. The glow of the clock's digits bathed my room in a dull, unmoving light. 3:33. The numbers sat frozen, unblinking, as if the concept of time itself had forgotten how to exist. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for the minute to change, for the soft mechanical shift of time pressing forward, as it always did. But nothing happened. The silence in my room stretched impossibly thin. The air felt wrong. Not cold, not warm, just unnatural. As if it had been emptied of sound, of motion, of everything except my own shallow breaths. I reached for my phone, my fingers stiff against the smooth glass screen. No notifications, no missed calls, and worse, no time. The numbers on the lock screen were missing, leaving only a blank space where they should have been. As if time had been erased, a cold weight settled in my chest. I turned my head, slowly, towards the window. The curtains were slightly open, revealing a sliver of the outside world, but there was nothing there. No street, no sky, just an endless stretch of fog. It pressed against the glass, thick and unmoving, swallowing everything beyond. My fingers twitched at my side. I wanted to believe this was part of the dream, a lingering peace that hadn't fully let go. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. This was different. This was real. A soft sound, so quiet I almost missed it, shifted the air behind me. Not a creak, not a breath, just the feeling of something being there. I turned my head slowly. The mirror across the room reflected my bed, my nightstand, the frozen clock. But the moment my gaze landed on it, my stomach dropped, because something was missing, me. The mirror was empty. The bed in the reflection was untouched, as if no one had ever laid in it. The room was identical in every way, but I wasn't there. My throat tightened. My pulse was steady, too steady, like my body had yet to understand the depth of what was happening. Then the mirror shifted, not a movement, not a crack, just a change, a slight, imperceptible delay between what was real and what was reflected. And then the door in the mirror opened, not the door in my room, just the one in the reflection. A dark hallway stretched beyond it, thick with shadow. And slowly, too slowly, something stepped forward, a figure, not mine, not quite human, but watching me the way it had in the dream. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of its unseen gaze settle deep in my bones. My breath felt thin, stretched, like something was pulling at the edges of reality, unraveling it thread by thread. Then, without sound, it lifted a hand, not to wave, not to reach, but to press a single finger against its lips. A silent command, a warning, don't move, don't speak, don't wake up. And as the words settled into the air, I realized something even worse. The clock still hadn't changed. Time was no longer mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure in the mirror stood just beyond the threshold of the open door. A door that did not exist in my room. The darkness behind it was thick, pressing against the edges of the frame like a living thing. And though I couldn't see its face, I felt its gaze settle deep into my bones. Its finger remained against its lips, an unspoken command hanging in the air like a weight. Be still. Be quiet. My heart pounded against my ribs, but the room around me was impossibly silent. No ticking clock. No hum of electricity. No breath of wind slipping through the cracks of the window. Just absence, and then it stepped forward. Not into my room, into the mirror. The surface didn't ripple, didn't crack. The reflection simply swallowed it, as if it had always been part of the scene. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn away. But something inside me knew that moving would be the wrong choice. Instead, I watched. The figure did not look away as it moved. Its limbs carried it smoothly, fluidly, across the room that wasn't mine, past my untouched bed, past my nightstand, and with its frozen clock. And then, with slow, deliberate intent, it turned toward the window. The fog outside the reflection pulsed. Thickened, responded. The figure reached out, pressing one hand against the glass, and my window. The real one frosted over beneath unseen fingertips. A shudder ran through me, cold and sharp, as if the air had turned to ice. I glanced at my actual window, watching as frost bloomed across the surface, creeping outward like veins in broken glass. It wasn't just in the mirror anymore, it was here. I took a slow, careful step backward. The figure in the mirror tilted its head. A slight movement, a deliberate acknowledgement, and then it spoke, not with words, not with sound, but with a voice that slipped directly into my mind. You're closer now. The frost thickened, cracking slightly under the weight of silence, but you still don't see. A pulse ran through the room, low and distant, like the hum of something enormous stirring beneath reality. I opened my mouth to say what I didn't know, but my voice caught in my throat, because in the mirror something had changed. The reflection no longer showed my room. It showed the street from my dream, the endless houses, the flickering streetlights, the curling fog, and standing beneath the nearest street lamp was me, not the figure, me, standing alone, staring at the window, watching myself from the other side. I sucked in a breath, and this time, when I blinked, the mirror was empty. The frost on the window had vanished. The reflection was normal again, but something deep inside me knew the truth. It wasn't gone, it was waiting, and I had taken another step toward it. I left the room, not because I wanted to, not because I thought it would help, but because something deep inside me knew. I couldn't stay there. The mirror had gone still. My reflection had returned. The frost on the window had faded, but the feeling hadn't left. The air was still too heavy, thick with a presence I couldn't name. I stepped into the hallway, dark. Still, silent. The air smelled different here. Like dust and old wood, like something untouched for years. But that didn't make sense. I had walked these halls every night. The framed pictures on the wall, the soft creak of the floorboards, everything should have been familiar. But it wasn't, because the hallway was longer than it should have been. I took another step forward, then another. The dim glow from my bedroom barely reached beyond the doorway, swallowed quickly by the dark. My fingers traced the wall as I moved, feeling the subtle shift in texture, smooth paint turning to something rougher, older. Had the walls always been this way? Had the house always been this way? A soft sound breathed through the space. Not a voice, not a whisper, a sigh. Somewhere ahead, I stopped. The air held still, thick with waiting. I turned my head slightly, listening. My heartbeat filled the silence, steady but too slow, like time had stretched thin around me. Then tap, tap, tap. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, close. I swallowed hard. They weren't mine. I stepped backward. The footsteps stepped forward. I turned, ran. The hallway did not end. Doors flickered past me. Doors I didn't recognize, doors that shouldn't be there. Their knobs glinted in the dark, untouched, locked, waiting. I reached the stairwell, too wide, too deep. The stairs spiraled downward, disappearing into a blackness I couldn't see the bottom of. And somewhere below, something else was breathing. Not a sigh, not a whisper, something slow, heavy, deep. I stepped back. My chest tightened. I wasn't supposed to be here. The realization sank in slow, curling around my ribs like a second set of lungs. This was my house. But it wasn't. I turned sharply, moving fast, retracing my steps, but the hallway behind me had changed. The pictures on the walls were wrong. Not family portraits, not landscapes, but frames filled with black. Empty, hollow, watching. A single picture in the center had a shape. A figure standing under a street lamp. I didn't look closer. I didn't have to. I already knew what I'd see. I ran. Doors blurred past me, the air pressing tighter, heavier. The house itself felt awake, shifting. Then a door at the end of the hallway. One I didn't remember. And the doorknob was turning. I stopped. A sliver of darkness cracked open. The air on the other side felt different, colder. Thinner, the door creaked wider, and then a voice, not from inside, from behind me. "You're not supposed to be here yet." My breath caught. The room behind the door lurched forward. I fell. And the last thing I saw before the dark swallowed me was the street lamp from my dream. I hit the ground, but it didn't feel like falling. It felt like waking up. The cold seeped into my skin before I could take a breath. I was lying on pavement. Not my bedroom floor, not the hallway, but a street. The air was thick with mist. The sky stretched wide above me, empty of stars. I knew this place, the rows of identical houses, the narrow sidewalks, the way the streetlights hummed softly, flickering just enough to make the shadows shift. The dream, but it wasn't a dream anymore. I pushed myself up, my fingers pressing into the cracks in the road. Everything felt too real. The pavement scraped my palms, the damp air clung to my skin. My breath formed small clouds in front of me. I turned, the street stretched in both directions, endless, featureless. No cars, no people, just houses with dark windows watching. Then, ahead, a flicker of movement. Under the nearest street lamp, a figure stood. I knew what I would see before my eyes fully adjusted. It was me, standing perfectly still, staring back. I couldn't see the face, not fully. The shadows from the street lamp stretched over its features, blurring them, distorting them just enough that I knew it was me, but also knew that it wasn't. A cold pulse of something wrong ran through me. I swallowed hard. Hello. The word barely left my mouth before something shifted. The figure under the street lamp didn't move, but everything around it did. The houses, the sky, the street itself. They bent, not like a trick of the light, not like fog, but like something pulling at the edges of the world. I blinked, and the street was different. The houses had changed, their shapes, their roofs, the number of windows. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough that I knew they weren't the same. The figure was gone. I turned sharply, my pulse pounding in my ears. The silence was thick, pressing in around me. The air felt too dense, too aware. I wasn't alone. I felt it before I saw it. Something in the corner of my vision, a shape at the edge of the sidewalk, watching. I turned my head slowly. A house identical to the others, but different. Its door was open, just slightly, just enough for me to see that there was nothing inside. No furniture, no walls, just blackness, a void that wasn't empty at all. My stomach tightened then, the sound. A whisper, not in my ears, but in my mind, "Come in." The door creaked wider, and before I could move, before I could run, the street behind me disappeared. There was no choice left. I stepped forward, into the dark. The darkness swallowed me whole. For a moment there was nothing. No sound, no space, no sense of direction. It wasn't just dark, it was absence, a complete and total void. Then, slowly, something formed around me. A floor beneath my feet, walls stretching upward, the whisper of air moving through a space too large to see. I wasn't outside anymore. I was inside the house. The door had vanished. There was no way back. The air was thick with dust, though I couldn't see it. I could feel it settling against my skin, pressing into my lungs. The darkness wasn't complete anymore. The faintest glow came from somewhere deeper inside, like light filtering through endless corridors. I took a step forward. The floor didn't creak, didn't shift. It felt solid, but in a way that made me uneasy, like it wasn't real, like it only existed because I needed something to stand on. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the wall beside me. The texture was wrong, not wood, not plaster. Something softer, something that gave slightly under my touch before settling back into place. I pulled my hand away. The glow ahead of me pulsed, a slow, steady rhythm like breathing. I had no choice but to follow it. With each step, the space around me seemed to shift. The walls curved inward, then stretched wider. The ceiling wasn't always above me. Sometimes it felt too close, pressing down. Other times it seemed so high that it vanished into nothing. There were doors along the hallway. Some were cracked open, revealing only blackness. Others were shut so tightly that I knew they weren't meant to be opened. Then a sound, not a whisper, not a breath, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. I turned my head, my body stiff with tension. The sound was coming from behind one of the doors, the only one that was fully open. I took a slow step forward, peering inside. The room was empty, no furniture, no windows, just walls and a floor and a single mirror standing in the center. The tapping sound continued, coming from the other side of the glass. I stepped closer. The glow pulsed behind me, making my shadow stretch long across the floor. In the mirror, I saw myself, standing still, watching, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't matching me. I took a breath. It didn't. I shifted my weight. It stayed perfectly still. The tapping stopped. For a long moment there was silence. Then the reflection smiled. A slow, deliberate movement. I did not. The glow flickered. The walls contracted. And then, from deep within the house, something called my name. A voice I knew. A voice I shouldn't be hearing. The mirror darkened. The reflection stepped forward, and the door slammed shut. The door slammed behind me, but I barely noticed. Because the reflection was gone. The mirror stood in the center of the empty room, its surface no longer showing my image. Instead, it was black, not like a mirror in the dark, but like a void, like a window into something that shouldn't be looked at. And from within that darkness, something moved, a ripple, like a disturbance on the surface of still water. Then the voice came again, soft, familiar, impossible, calling my name. I staggered back, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. I knew that voice. I knew it as well as my own. It was my mother's, but she wasn't here. She couldn't be here. "Come inside," the voice whispered, gentle, coaxing. "It's cold out there." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to breathe. The mirror was just a mirror. It wasn't a door. It wasn't real. Except I could feel warmth radiating from it. Like there really was something on the other side. My hands curled into fists. The room around me pressed inward, silent and watching. I took another step back, my spine nearly hitting the wall. I couldn't let it trick me, but then, a shadow in the glass. A shape, a figure moving closer. The voice softened, the way it used to when I was a child waking from a nightmare. "You've been gone too long." My throat tightened. The figure behind the glass was clearer now. It was her. Or at least, it looked like her. Same hair, same kind eyes, same soft, familiar tilt of the head. But something wasn't right. She was standing too still, not breathing, not shifting her weight, just waiting. And then her head tilted too far. Too slow, too unnatural. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't match. Like a puppet, the mouth moved first, the sound followed. "Come inside." A jolt of terror ripped through me. That wasn't her. I turned to run. The room was gone. The walls had melted into darkness. The door was missing. There was only the mirror now, and from its depths a hand emerged. Pale, thin, reaching. I choked back a scream, stumbling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The dark stretched infinitely in every direction, swallowing everything. And then the hand grabbed my wrist, cold, too solid, too strong, and it pulled. For a moment the world shattered. The darkness exploded with light. My mind lurched, my body falling forward, into the glass, into the void, into the impossible. And I knew I was no longer in the house. I had gone somewhere else, somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. I was falling, but there was no wind, no motion, no sense of direction. Just the feeling of being pulled. The darkness around me wasn't empty. It moved, shifting like liquid, pressing against my skin. Not quite air, not quite water. It felt like something alive, something that knew I was there. Then impact, but it wasn't a crash, it was a landing. My body settled onto something solid, though I never felt the moment my descent stopped. I was standing. My breath hitched as I took in my surroundings. I was outside. At least it looked like I was. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, but it wasn't blue. It wasn't any color I could name. A shifting, shimmering expanse, like a reflection without a surface, like a memory half forgotten. The air smelled of nothing, completely sterile, as if scent itself didn't exist here. And in front of me, a road. It stretched endlessly in both directions, made of something dark and smooth, not quite stone, not quite asphalt. And it was lined with doors, hundreds of them, thousands, more than my mind could comprehend, each one different. Some tall, some narrow, some old and splintered, some polished and new. Some were shaped wrong, curved in ways that made my stomach twist, angles that shouldn't exist. They stood alone. No walls, no buildings, just doors rising from the ground, waiting. I turned in a slow circle, heart pounding. I wasn't alone. Not far from me, something watched. A figure stood at the edge of the road, shrouded in a haze that made it impossible to see clearly. I squinted, my pulse hammering in my ears. The moment I spoke, the figure vanished. A rush of cold swept over me, like something had moved past me at impossible speed. I shuddered. The doors stood silent, but I knew they weren't empty. I took a cautious step forward. The smooth ground made no sound beneath my feet. Somewhere, something whispered. It wasn't a voice. Not really, more like a thought, drifting across my mind. Choose. I stiffened. The doors seemed closer now. Or maybe the space had shifted around me. One door in particular drew me in. It was smaller than the others, made of dark wood with a brass handle. The kind of door you'd find in an old house, familiar, almost comforting. But carved into its surface was a single word. My name. A shiver ran down my spine. I didn't want to touch it, but even as I hesitated, I knew. I would. I had to. Slowly, I reached out. The brass handle was cold, and as soon as my fingers closed around it, the door swung open. And I stepped through. The moment I stepped through, the world changed. It wasn't a sudden shift, not like falling or waking up. It was slow, seamless, a transition so natural it felt wrong. I was in a house, not just any house, my childhood home. The scent of old wood and warm dust settled in my lungs, and for a moment I almost forgot where I had just been. The hallway stretched before me, bathed in dim, golden light, the way it had looked on late winter afternoons. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, exactly where they always had. The living room was just ahead. I hesitated. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But everything was exactly as I remembered. The framed photographs along the wall. The scratch on the wooden banister from when I had tripped as a child. The coat rack by the door, with my mother's scarf still hanging in its place, even though I hadn't seen it in years. I swallowed hard. The house was empty, too empty. There was no distant hum of the refrigerator, no ticking clock, no birds outside the window, only my own breath. I stepped forward, my fingers brushing against the edge of the banister. The silence deepened. The air felt heavier now, pressing against my skin. Not like warmth, but like a presence. And then, a voice, soft, close, "You shouldn't have come back." I froze. The voice was behind me. Slowly, I turned. The hallway was longer now, stretching into the distance, fading into darkness, at the very end of it. A door that wasn't supposed to be there. It stood slightly open, and beyond it, something moved, a shadow shifting just out of sight. I knew, with a deep, instinctive certainty, if I went through that door, I wouldn't come back. The floor beneath me creaked, but I hadn't moved. Something else had. The air turned cold. The golden light dimmed, flickering like a dying candle. And then footsteps, soft, slow, coming toward me. I stepped back, my pulse thundering in my ears. The steps didn't stop. They were close now, too close. I turned, ready to run, but the moment I did, the house collapsed around me. The walls melted into darkness, the ceiling stretched upward, vanishing into infinity. The air rushed past me, pulling me forward. And then I was somewhere else, again. I didn't land, I simply arrived. One moment I was falling through the collapsing house, walls warping, floors stretching into nothingness, and then I was here. A room, not a dreamlike expanse, not an endless void, just a room, small, quiet, familiar in a way that made my stomach tighten. The floor was made of dark wood, smooth and polished. The walls were painted a deep gray, blue, almost black in the dim light. A single window sat across from me, its curtains drawn, but there was no glow behind them, no indication that anything existed outside. A desk, a chair, a single bed with neatly folded sheets. It looked lived in, but it wasn't mine, and yet I had been here before. The thought came unbidden, curling at the edges of my mind like smoke. I knew this place, I just didn't know how. I turned slowly, taking everything in. The air was thick, heavy in my lungs. A faint scent of old books and something sweeter, faintly metallic, like copper. The door behind me was closed. I hadn't heard it shut. I swallowed, unease creeping up my spine. There were no pictures on the walls, no signs of who this room belonged to. But then my gaze landed on the desk, and my breath stopped, because there, sitting neatly at its center, was a journal. And written in bold ink, black letters on its cover was my name. I didn't want to touch it. I did anyway. The leather was warm beneath my fingertips, not like a book left in the sun, but like skin. I exhaled shakily, then flipped it open. The pages were filled, line after line of handwriting, some neat, some frantic, the ink smudged in places, as if written in a hurry. I recognized the handwriting. It was mine, but I didn't remember writing any of this. The first page held a date, years ago. A time when I should have been in school, living my normal life. But according to these words, I had been here. This wasn't my first time in this place. A chill prickled along my skin. My hands trembled as I turned the pages, scanning entry after entry. Each one described things I didn't remember, doors, endless roads, familiar places twisted into something wrong. The feeling of being watched. A phrase appeared over and over again, scribbled in the margins, underlined with shaky hands. Don't look at it. My pulse pounded in my ears. Look at what? A soft sound broke the silence, a whisper of movement. From the bed, the sheets they had shifted, like someone had just been lying there, watching me. I backed away, heart hammering. My hand brushed against something, the door handle. I didn't think. I turned it. It was locked. A sound behind me. A slow, stretching creak. The bed spring shifting. I didn't turn around. I couldn't, because suddenly I remembered. I knew what the journal meant. I wasn't supposed to look. The air turned frigid. My breath came fast, uneven. The bed springs creaked again. Something was getting up, and it was right behind me. I didn't move. I couldn't. The weight of something unseen pressed against my back, thick and suffocating. The bed springs had stopped creaking. Whatever was behind me was standing now, watching, waiting. I kept my hand clenched around the door handle, my knuckles white. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. My own breath sounded too loud in the silence. The words from the journal screamed inside my mind. Don't look at it. I squeezed my eyes shut, heartbeat hammering against my ribs. If I turned around, if I let my gaze meet whatever was there, something irreversible would happen. The air shifted. The thing behind me breathed. It wasn't a normal breath. It was shallow, hollow, like air moving through an empty space where lungs should have been. Then it took a step. The floor didn't creak. It didn't even sound like footsteps, just a faint, dragging noise, as if something wasn't walking, but pulling itself forward. I clenched my jaw. I needed to get out, but the door was locked. My fingers twisted the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had fused into the frame. Behind me, the sound stopped. Silence, and then a voice. My voice, where do you think you're going? The air left my lungs. It was me, or something trying to be me. The voice was perfect, identical in tone and rhythm, but there was something off, something too smooth, too deliberate. I squeezed my eyes tighter, my mind racing. I couldn't listen to it. I couldn't engage. I pressed my forehead against the door, willing it to open, praying for it to just let me through. The voice came again, closer. You already know, don't you? I shook my head. Don't listen. Don't turn around. A pause, then. I look just like you now. I bit down on my lip, hard enough to taste blood. Something brushed against my shoulder. I jerked away, slamming my palm against the door. I didn't care if it was locked. I just needed to be anywhere but here. I pushed, and this time the door gave way. I stumbled forward, thrown into darkness, weightless again, falling into nothing. As the room behind me vanished, the last thing I heard was my own voice laughing. I wasn't falling. Not this time. I was sinking. The darkness was thick, dense, more than just an absence of light. It clung to me, heavy as water, pressing against my skin, filling my lungs with a silence so deep it felt like drowning. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only descend. Then, slowly, I landed, not with a crash, not even with a thud. Just a gentle settling, as if I had always been meant to arrive here. I opened my eyes. A hallway stretched before me. Long, endless. The walls were lined with doors, hundreds of them. Some were open, revealing slivers of things I couldn't comprehend. Twisting shapes that shouldn't move but did. Glimpses of places I half remembered. A school hallway, a rainy street, a hospital room with a bed that was already occupied. Other doors were shut tight, and then there were the locked ones. Chains looped through iron handles, bolts sealed into the frames. Some of the locks were rusted, as if they hadn't been touched in years. Others were new, glinting under the dim, sourceless light. I knew, without understanding how, that I had been here before. This place remembered me. A distant sound echoed down the corridor, footsteps. Not loud, not hurried, just steady, getting closer. I didn't want to see who or what was coming. I turned, searching for a way out. A door to my left stood slightly open, its hinges groaning as if it had just been pushed. Inside, a warm glow flickered, soft and inviting. I hesitated, but the footsteps behind me didn't. I stepped inside. The door closed behind me on its own. I was in a child's bedroom, familiar in a way that sent ice through my veins. The wallpaper faded stars on a dark blue background. The bed small, covered in a blanket I hadn't seen in years. A wooden dresser, its top lined with dusty picture frames. I stepped closer, my breath caught in my throat. The pictures inside the frames were all of me, but the images weren't right. Some were from moments I remembered: a birthday party, a school field trip, an afternoon in the park. But others showed me in places I had never been. Standing at the edge of a forest I didn't recognize. Sitting in a train car, staring out at an unfamiliar landscape. Walking down a hallway that looked just like this one. And in the last frame, I wasn't alone. A figure stood just behind me, its features blurred, its hands resting on my shoulders. A chill slithered down my spine. Behind me, the door creaked open. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Because somehow, I already knew who would be standing there. And I knew they would be wearing my face. I didn't turn around. I refused to turn around, but the door was open now. I could hear the faint shift of fabric, the soft sound of someone breathing. Someone who wasn't me. The bedroom around me felt smaller. The walls, once familiar, seemed to tighten, pressing inward. The glow from the bedside lamp flickered, stretching my shadow across the floor, but there was another shadow beside it. And it was closer than it should have been. I swallowed hard, my gaze fixed on the photographs in front of me. My hands trembled as I lifted the last frame, the one with the blurred figure standing behind me. Up close, the distortion wasn't random. It wasn't a trick of the camera. It was shifting. The blur rippled like water, its edges sharpening, focusing until I saw the face beneath it. Mine, my own expression stared back at me, but the eyes were wrong, too dark, too hollow. The lips were curved into a smile I had never made. And then the reflection blinked. Not the glass, not the photo, me. My own reflection staring at me from inside the picture. And in the same instant, something moved behind me, a whisper of air against my neck. A voice, my voice, spoke softly. "You don't remember, do you?" A hand rested on my shoulder, cold, too cold. I couldn't breathe. My throat locked, my pulse hammering against my ribs. It was touching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. The fingers curled slightly, pressing into my skin, and I felt it. Not skin. Not flesh, something wrong. Like fabric stretched too tight over empty space. Like a mask. My reflection in the glass smiled wider. "That's okay," it whispered. "I remember for you." The fingers tightened, and then the light in the room went out. Darkness swallowed everything. The grip on my shoulder vanished, replaced by an unbearable silence. The air was thick, heavy, and then footsteps, not retreating, circling. Something was still in the room with me. But now I didn't know where it was. I clenched my jaw, my breath shallow, listening. And then just inches from my ear, my own voice whispered, "It's your turn now." The darkness split open beneath me, and I fell. I was falling again, but this time it was different. The air wasn't rushing past me. There was no stomach, lurching drop, no endless abyss pulling me downward. Instead, it felt like I was being lowered, carefully placed, like something unseen was guiding me, then solid ground. I landed softly, my feet sinking into something cool and smooth. Not wood, not stone, something else. I opened my eyes. A vast, endless corridor stretched before me. But it wasn't like the hallway I had seen before. This one was wrong. The walls were made of something dark and polished, reflecting a distorted version of myself in their surface. The ceiling was too high to see, swallowed by shadows, and the floor I looked down. It wasn't floor at all. It was water, perfectly still, dark, stretching endlessly in every direction. My feet stood on its surface as if it were solid, but I knew. If I moved too suddenly, I would sink. A soft sound echoed in the distance, a single, deliberate drip, then another. The air was heavy with the scent of something old, something that had been forgotten for too long. And then I heard it, a whisper, not from behind me, not from in front of me, from beneath the water. I swallowed hard, forcing my feet to stay still. The surface beneath me was smooth, unbroken, but I could feel something beneath it. Moving, waiting, watching, another drip, then a voice, soft, distant, yet so close it felt like it was already inside my head. "You left us here." My body tensed. The words weren't spoken with anger or accusation. They were just stated. A fact. I tried to answer, but my throat was dry. I didn't know who I had left. I didn't know what this place was. But something deep inside me did. The air grew colder. I took a slow step forward, the water beneath me rippling slightly, but not breaking. With each step, the reflections in the walls shifted. Not just mine anymore. There were others. Shapes flickering just beneath the surface, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. Too many hands, too many eyes, and then one of them turned to face me. Not my reflection, someone else. A face half, shrouded in shadow, familiar yet unplaceable. And as they stared at me, their lips parted. No sound came out, but the voice, that voice beneath the water, spoke again. "Come back." My breath hitched. Come back to where? I shook my head, stepping back, my pulse hammering. The movement sent another ripple through the surface beneath me. A small, harmless disturbance. But the moment it spread, the whispering voices grew louder. No longer a single voice, but dozens, hundreds, calling to me, "Come back." The shadows in the walls moved all at once, and the water beneath me broke open. Cold hands grabbed my ankles, and I was pulled down. The water swallowed me whole, but it wasn't water, not really. It was thick, clinging to my skin like ink, dragging me downward with a slow, deliberate pull. My limbs refused to move, as if something unseen had wrapped around them, holding me in place. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me was silent, impossibly deep, stretching far beyond where my eyes could see, and in that silence I felt them. The ones I had left behind. Shapes moved in the darkness, slow and deliberate. Shadows with faces I almost recognized. Their hands reached toward me, fingers curling in unnatural, disjointed movements. One of them drifted closer. Its face was familiar, too familiar. It was me, not a reflection, not a distorted image in a photograph. It was me, but different, paler, eyes sunken, lips cracked, a version of myself that had been here for too long, waiting. And when it opened its mouth, I finally heard it. "You left us here." The words echoed through the liquid abyss, vibrating through my bones. The other shapes moved closer, their whispers blending together, overlapping, repeating the same phrase in 100 different voices. "You left us here. You left us here. You left us here." I tried to struggle, to fight against the grip pulling me deeper, but the hands only tightened, their fingers pressing into my skin. I was sinking into something vast, something endless, something that remembered me. I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing my mind to focus, trying to remember how I had gotten here, why this place knew my name, why these figures wore my face. And then I saw it, a flash of memory, a hospital bed, dim fluorescent lights, the steady beep of a heart monitor. Someone was lying there. I was lying there, eyes closed, breathing shallow, unmoving, trapped. A realization crashed through me like ice. This wasn't just a dream. This was something else, something deeper. The figures around me grew restless, their movements more urgent, their whispers growing louder, overlapping until they became a single, distorted wail. And then I saw a light, faint, distant, a break in the darkness above me. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, fighting against the hands trying to keep me below. The whispers turned to screams, the figures clawed at me, their grip tightening, refusing to let me go. But I kept reaching. The light grew brighter, cutting through the ink, black depths, and for the first time since I had fallen into this dream, I was rising. The darkness shuddered, the hands loosened, and then I broke the surface. I broke through the surface, gasping for air. But the air wasn't real. It was too still, too thick, too familiar. I was back in my bedroom, the sheets twisted around my legs. The bedside lamp cast a dull glow over the walls, stretching my shadow long and thin across the floor. Everything was exactly as I had left it, except it wasn't. My breath slowed as I scanned the room. The air smelled faintly of dust, but something underneath it was wrong. A scent I couldn't quite place, like damp earth, like the static before a storm. I swallowed hard. The door was closed now, but I hadn't closed it. A prickle ran down my spine. I shifted, feeling the sheets pull against my skin. Too heavy, too cold, and then my breath hitched, because something was lying beside me. I felt it before I saw it. The weight on the mattress, the subtle shift of fabric, the slow, rhythmic sound of breathing, not mine. I turned my head too fast, too sudden, and I saw myself, lying beside me, eyes open, watching. The other me didn't blink, didn't move, just stared with a quiet, patient stillness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. For a long, stretched moment, we simply stared at each other. Then the other me smiled, not a normal smile, not a human smile, something wider, something stretched too far, too thin. And then it whispered, "You left me there." The sheets ripped away, the lights flickered, and I wasn't in my room anymore. I was standing in a hallway, long, narrow, stretching into the distance. The walls were lined with doors, each identical, each shut. The air here was colder, thick with something I couldn't name, the kind of silence that pressed against my eardrums, like the whole world was waiting. I turned slowly, my bare feet pressing against a floor that felt too smooth. Something about this place gnawed at the edges of my memory. I've been here before. A soft click echoed behind me, a door opening. I turned and saw a figure standing in the doorway. Not moving, not speaking, just watching. Their face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel their gaze like a weight against my chest. And then, in the quiet, they spoke, soft, familiar. "It's time to wake up now." My pulse pounded. I was awake. Wasn't I? The figure tilted their head slightly. Then, they stepped forward, and the hallway shattered. The hallway shattered around me, not like breaking glass, but like something far more fragile. The walls cracked, peeled away, and dissolved into dust, leaving nothing but a vast, empty darkness. For a moment I was nowhere, suspended, weightless. Then, just as suddenly, the world reassembled itself. I was standing in the middle of a town, but not just any town. It was a place I knew. And yet, it wasn't. The cobblestone streets stretched ahead in a perfect grid, buildings lined up in neat rows. The lamplights flickered, casting long, golden pools of light onto the pavement. The air smelled of rain, like it had just fallen, or was about to. It should have felt comforting, but it didn't. Because something was missing. The town was empty, no people, no movement, no sound except for the distant rustling of unseen wind. I turned slowly, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then a single figure appeared at the end of the street, standing perfectly still, dressed in dark clothing, their face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide, brimmed hat. They weren't there a second ago, but they were now, watching, waiting. I took a step back, and the lamps flickered off. Not all at once, one by one. Starting from the farthest end of the street, the darkness creeping closer. Click, click, click. Each light snuffing out as if swallowed by the night itself. The figure didn't move. But the darkness behind them did. Something was there. Something in the shadows, moving, crawling, coming closer. I turned and ran. The streets blurred around me, stretching, twisting. No matter which way I turned, the roads were the same. The same lamplights, the same buildings, the same flickering shadows at my back. I wasn't running away. I was running in circles. Then a new sound, a bell. Distant at first, but growing louder. A deep, ringing chime that vibrated through my bones. Ahead of me, a door appeared. A simple wooden door, standing alone in the middle of the road. I had no choice. I grabbed the handle and threw it open, and the moment I stepped through I was falling again. But this time, something was falling with me. I was falling. The wind howled past me, though there was no sky, no earth, no sense of where I had come from or where I was going. And I wasn't alone. Something was falling beside me, not a person, not exactly, a shape shifting, warping. A figure that flickered between forms, sometimes tall, sometimes impossibly thin, sometimes nothing more than a blur. But always watching. I could feel its gaze pressing against me, even though it had no eyes. Then, just as suddenly as the fall had begun, I landed. But I didn't hit the ground. I hit a memory. I was sitting in a chair. The chair was hard, wooden, familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. Because I knew this place. It was a small waiting room, pale green walls peeling at the corners, a cheap clock ticking too loudly on the wall, a desk at the far end where a receptionist should have been. But the desk was empty, and I was alone. Or so I thought. Across from me, another chair, another me, sitting perfectly still, not blinking, not breathing. Just watching. I swallowed hard. I knew better than to speak to it. I had learned that much by now. Instead, I focused on the room itself, my eyes flicking across the details, searching for something, anything that made sense. And then I saw it, a pattern. The clock on the wall wasn't counting time. The second hand was moving backward. The pale green paint on the walls wasn't just peeling. It was reforming, like something trying to heal itself. The floor tiles weren't lined up correctly. Somewhere, deep in my bones, I felt it. This wasn't a memory. This was a trap. I turned back to the other me, but the chair was empty, and before I could react, a voice whispered behind me. Soft, cold, familiar. You're starting to understand, aren't you? I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The air behind me had changed, thickened. It wasn't just a presence standing there. It was a weight. A force pressing against the space where I sat, making the air harder to breathe, the walls tighter, the room smaller. But I forced myself to stay still. I had learned something in this dream. Whatever was behind me, it wanted me to acknowledge it. It wanted me to turn, to react, to see it. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that. So I focused on the room instead. The waiting room. The clock was still ticking backward, each second pulling me further from something I couldn't name. The walls still pulsed, the peeling paint moving like slow, growing ivy. The floor tiles still didn't match up. And that's when I noticed something else, something that hadn't been there before. A door, not the one I had come through. This one was different, older. The wood was dark, warped with time. Deep claw marks ran across its surface, long, jagged scrapes that had been made by something desperate. I swallowed. The door didn't have a handle, but it had a keyhole, and somehow, deep inside my chest, I knew I had the key. I reached into my pocket. I didn't remember putting anything there, but my fingers closed around something small and cold. I pulled it out, holding it up to the dim waiting room light. A key, old, rusted, the kind you'd find in a house that had been abandoned for 100 years. The moment I saw it, the whisper behind me grew louder. You know where it leads. A hand brushed against my shoulder. Cold, too cold, that was enough. I lurched forward, shoving the key into the lock, and the moment it turned, the waiting room collapsed. I was standing in a field now, an endless stretch of tall grass swaying beneath a black sky. The stars above weren't stars. They were eyes, blinking, watching, waiting. In the distance, something moved. A figure, walking toward me, slow but deliberate. And with each step, the world around me shifted. I wasn't just standing in a field anymore. I was standing in everywhere I had ever been in this dream. The cobblestone streets, the infinite hallway, the flickering lamplights, the bedroom that wasn't mine. All of it folded in on itself. Pieces stacking, overlapping, merging into something impossible. The dream wasn't falling apart. It was pulling itself together, and the figure was still approaching, and I knew, deep in my chest, I was finally going to see who had been watching me all along. The figure kept walking, slow, steady, each step deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. And maybe they did. The world around me wasn't stable anymore. It twisted, flickered, pieces of different places bleeding into one another. The cobblestone streets blurred into endless hallways. The waiting room melted into the field. the door I had unlocked floating somewhere in the distance, half buried in the swaying grass. And above me the eyes, hundreds, thousands, suspended in the vast darkness of the sky, unblinking, watching my every move. But none of them mattered, not compared to the one walking toward me. I braced myself, for what, I didn't know. And then they stepped into the light. It was me, not a stranger, not a monster, not some faceless entity from the dream. It was me, dressed exactly as I was now, down to the scuffed shoes and the faint crease in my shirt. Except their expression wasn't mine. I wasn't sure I had ever seen my own face look like that before. There was no fear, no confusion, only understanding. They tilted their heads slightly, studying me, as if they were waiting for me to speak. I swallowed hard. "You've been following me," I said. My voice was hoarse, smaller than I expected. The other me nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. But why? I pressed. What is this? What is happening to me? For the first time, the other me spoke. And when they did, the dream itself shuddered. "You're almost awake." The words settled into my bones like ice. Awake. I wasn't awake now. The other me must have seen the confusion on my face because they sighed. "You think this is a dream," they continued, "but it's not really. It's a place you've been before." I shook my head. "I don't, you do," they interrupted, stepping closer. "You just don't remember." The sky darkened. The eyes above us blinked in unison, and suddenly, the ground beneath me wasn't solid anymore. The pieces of the dream, the field, the streets, the hallways, all of them began pulling away, unraveling like threads. And through the cracks, I saw something beneath it all, something that shouldn't exist. And for the first time since this all began, I felt real fear. The ground beneath me fractured, not like stone breaking, not like wood splintering. It peeled, like old wallpaper being pulled away, like fabric being unraveled thread by thread. And underneath there was nothing, not darkness, not emptiness. Something worse, a vast, shifting depth too deep for my mind to comprehend. Not a pit, not a void, but a place where things had no shape, where movement had no direction, where time was not counted in minutes or hours, but in the slow, inevitable pulling of something unseen. I staggered back, my breath coming too fast, too uneven. I wasn't standing in a dream anymore. I was standing on its edge. And the dream was starting to fall apart. The other me was still watching, still calm, like they had expected this. Like they had seen this before. "It's almost time," they said. The words barely registered over the sound, a low, distant hum. It came from the depths beneath the unraveling ground, a sound so deep I felt it in my ribs before I heard it with my ears. It wasn't a noise, it was awareness. Something below had noticed me, something that had been waiting. I turned back to the other me, heart pounding. "What is this?" I demanded. "What's down there?" They didn't answer. Instead, they reached into their pocket and pulled something out. I flinched before I even saw what it was, because I knew it was the key, the same one I had found, the one that had unlocked the waiting room door, the one that had started all of this. They held it up between two fingers, considering it, before meeting my eyes. And for the first time, their expression changed. Not calm, not detached, regretful. "You already opened the door," they said softly. "You can't close it now." The humming grew louder. The ground beneath us peeled faster. Through the gaps, I saw something shifting in the depths, moving, rising, and suddenly I remembered, not all of it, not yet, but pieces. This wasn't my first time here. Not my first time standing at the edge of the dream, watching it unravel. I had been here before, and whatever was beneath us, I had let it out before too. The dream tore apart around me. The field, the waiting room, the endless hallways, they all crumbled into the void beneath. Piece by piece, they peeled away, revealing what had always been underneath. The hum was no longer distant. It was here, a deep, resonant sound, vibrating through my bones, pulling at something inside me, something I didn't want to acknowledge. And then the memories came, not like a slow realization, not like a missing puzzle piece falling into place. They came like a flood, a rush of knowledge that wasn't mine, yet I felt it as if it had always been there. I had done this before, I had stood here before, and I had made a choice. The other me was watching, their expression unreadable. "You remember now," they said. It wasn't a question. I shook my head. "No, I don't. I don't understand. What did I do? What is this place?" They didn't answer right away. Instead, they turned, looking down at the unraveling ground, at the shifting, impossible thing rising from below. When they spoke again, their voice was softer. "You left the door open." The key in their hand glinted in the strange, flickering light. I felt a sharp pressure in my chest, not pain, not fear, recognition. I had held that key before. I had turned that key before. And I had left something unfinished. I staggered back, my mind racing, trying to pull together the scattered fragments of memory, trying to piece together the truth. "You mean—" My throat was dry. I didn't close it. The other me shook their head. "You never do." The hum turned into something else. A sound beneath sound, a whisper that wasn't a voice, a presence pressing in from all sides. And then a hand reached up from the void. Long fingers, pale and too thin, curling over the edge of the unraveling dream. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't some vague nightmare. It was real. It had always been real, and I wasn't waking up. I was sinking. The other me stepped closer, pressing the key into my palm. Their hand was cold, too cold, and when they spoke, it wasn't just their voice anymore. It was mine. "This time you have to finish it." The key in my palm felt wrong, not because it was unfamiliar, because it wasn't. I had held it before. I had felt the weight of it pressing into my skin, the cool metal biting into my palm. And I had turned it, somewhere in the past, somewhere in a memory just out of reach. I had turned this key before. And I had let something out. The hand gripping the edge of the dream twitched. Fingers, long, too thin, wrong, dug into the unraveling world. And then another hand, then another, rising, crawling. Something beneath the dream was trying to pull itself up, trying to reach me, trying to— No. Not trying, it had been waiting, waiting for me to come back, waiting for me to remember, waiting for me to do what I always did. I turned to the other me, my breath ragged. "You knew this would happen." I whispered. They nodded. It always does. Their voice was calm, too calm, like they had already lived through this moment 1,000 times before. And maybe they had. Maybe I had. Because deep in the back of my mind, in the parts of myself I had locked away, I knew how this ended. I knew what I had done before. I had left the door open. I had let it in. The dream continued to crumble. The sky was no longer a sky. It was a gaping, infinite watching thing. The ground was no longer solid. It was an unraveling thread. A thin, fragile layer between me and the thing that should never be awake. And in the center of it all, the door, standing exactly where I had left it. It was open, just a sliver. Barely a crack, but that was enough. The thing beneath the dream moved. A low, guttural sound rumbled up from the depths, too deep to be a voice, too heavy to be words. It was speaking, not to me, to the other me, and they listened. Their expression didn't change. No fear, no hesitation, only understanding. And when they turned back to me, their gaze was steady. "Close it," they said. Their voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was no kindness in it, only finality. Because this wasn't a request, this was a warning, and I knew if I didn't close the door now, I never would. The ground beneath me split open, the hands reached further. Something vast and hungry was about to crawl free. And I had one chance left, one choice, one moment. The key was still in my hand, the door was still open. And this time I wouldn't run. The key burned cold in my palm, pressing into my skin like a frozen brand. It felt heavier than before, as if something inside it had gained weight, as if it carried the burden of every choice I had ever made in this dream. Or rather, every choice I had refused to make, because this moment wasn't new. I had stood before this door before. I had held this key before, and I had failed before. The hands kept rising from below, more of them now. Too many to count, clawing at the edges of the unraveling dream. The fingers were long, stretched, reaching not just for the surface, but for me. They had been waiting, for me to hesitate, for me to do what I always did, for me to leave the door open. The hum in the air thickened, turning into something deeper, something that rattled in my bones. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was expectation. The thing beneath the dream wasn't just trying to climb up. It was waiting for me to choose, waiting for me to fail, waiting for me to turn away like I had every time before, and I almost did. The weight of it, the truth of it was suffocating. I had failed before, and if I had failed then, why would this time be any different? What if I wasn't meant to close the door? What if I was meant to let it through? The other me stood beside me, watching silently. They didn't move, they didn't speak, but I could feel their presence like a pressure against my skin. Because they weren't me, not exactly. They were the version of me who had already lived this moment, the one who had already seen what came next, and that meant they knew what I was about to do. Their eyes met mine, and in them I saw something strange, something I had never seen in them before. Hope. The door groaned as it shifted on its hinges, moving open just a fraction more. The hands below surged forward at once, clawing, grasping, dragging themselves higher. I felt something pulling at me. Not physically, something deeper, something in the fabric of the dream itself. A voice that wasn't a voice whispered beneath my thoughts, "Leave it open. Just this once. You don't even remember what's behind it. You don't remember why you locked it. Maybe it's something you need." I almost believed it. But deep in my gut, I knew the truth. I didn't need to remember. I just needed to act. My hand closed around the key. And this time I turned it. The lock clicked. The sound was small, but it rippled through the dream like a shockwave, like the final toll of a massive bell. The hands below froze. The hum shattered into silence, and the thing beneath the dream, the thing that had been waiting for me to fail, screamed. Not a sound, not a voice, something deeper, something worse, a wound in reality itself, something that had existed in the spaces between, in the gaps of forgotten moments, was being pushed back, denied, forced to stay where it belonged. And for the first time ever, I saw fear in those grasping hands. They clawed desperately at the unraveling edges of the dream, trying to pull themselves free, but the door was already closing. The cracks in the ground began to mend. The air became solid again. The weight pressing against my skin lifted. I felt it, the dream sealing itself shut, and then the door was gone. The thing in the depths was gone. And I was alone. The other me let out a slow breath, not in relief, not in triumph, but in finality. Like something had ended, for real, for good. I turned to them, my heartbeat still thundering in my ears. "What now?" I whispered. They didn't answer. They just smiled. Not a smirk, not a knowing grin, a real, tired, genuine smile. And as I watched, they began to fade. I was waking up. This time, I knew it for sure. And as the last pieces of the dream melted away, I heard the other me say one last thing, their voice softer than ever before. I awoke to silence. Not the kind of silence that comes with early morning stillness or a sleeping world. This was thicker, heavier, like the dream hadn't completely let go of me yet. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the weight of it off my chest. The sensation of the key was still there, an imprint lingering in my palm, even though I knew I had left it behind. Hadn't I? The air in my room felt off. It smelled the same, the faint trace of the old wooden furniture, the lingering scent of something sweet from the candle I had burned the night before. But the weight of the air was wrong, like something else was here, like something had followed me back. I sat up slowly, my body stiff as if I hadn't moved in days. My arms felt heavy, my head felt foggy. The dream was still clinging to me. No, I was still clinging to the dream. I turned my head toward the window. Outside, the world looked normal. The streetlights still glowed faintly against the pavement. The trees swayed gently in the wind. But something about the sky, it was just a little too deep, a little too empty, like the darkness wasn't just the absence of light, but something else entirely. Something waiting, watching. I blinked, and for a second, just a second, I thought I saw a hand pressed against the glass. But when I looked again, it was gone. Had it been there at all? Or was my mind still unraveling the edges of the dream? I wasn't sure anymore. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, pressing my feet against the floor, grounding myself. Everything was fine. I had closed the door. I had ended it, hadn't I? Then why did I feel like something had shifted? Like something had changed. I exhaled slowly and stood up. The floorboards beneath me groaned softly, the sound too loud in the heavy silence of the room. I took a step, then another. Each movement felt strange, like the air around me had thickened just slightly, like I was pushing through something invisible. I reached for the light switch, hesitating for just a moment before flipping it on. The bulb flickered. Once, twice, then it steadied. But in the instant before the light stabilized, I saw something, a shape, standing in the corner of my room. I turned my head sharply, but there was nothing there. The space was empty. Just the same old wooden dresser, the same mirror reflecting my dimly lit room, the same door, closed tightly, leading to the hallway. But the air still felt thick, and I wasn't convinced I was alone. I moved toward the dresser and hesitated in front of the mirror. My own reflection stared back at me, but something about it felt wrong, not in a way I could immediately explain. The features were all mine, the eyes, the hair, the expression of exhaustion, but the longer I looked, the less certain I was. Because the person staring back at me wasn't blinking. I wasn't blinking. I should have blinked by now. I should have. My reflection smiled, and I didn't. A cold wave of dread crawled up my spine. I took a step back. My reflection stayed exactly where it was. The smile widened, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't playful. It was knowing, and then my reflection raised its hand, slowly, deliberately, not a wave. Not a threat, an invitation, a silent offer. And in that moment, I understood something. Something I hadn't realized before. I had closed the door in the dream, but the dream wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't move, not at first. Not as the thing in the mirror held out its hand, its fingers curling ever so slightly in a motion that was neither a beckon nor a command. Just waiting. The reflection was still me, but it wasn't. Its eyes held something deeper, something just beneath the surface, like looking into a lake and realizing it had no bottom. And its smile, it knew something I didn't. The room was silent, but inside my head, I could hear something. A low hum, like the distant echo of a voice too far away to understand. Or maybe it wasn't a voice at all. Maybe it was just the dream pushing through. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to run. But some part of me, some deep, instinctual part knew that if I broke eye contact, if I turned my back to the mirror, I would be giving it something. An opening, a chance to step forward, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. I swallowed hard, forcing my breath to steady. It's just a dream, that's what I told myself. The dream was still lingering, still seeping through the cracks. But I had woken up, hadn't I? I could feel the solid floor beneath my feet, the warmth of the dim lamp on my skin, the slight chill in the air from the window I had left cracked open the night before. This was real. It had to be. But then why did my reflection take a step closer? And why did I not? The breath hitched in my throat. I hadn't moved. I was sure I hadn't moved. And yet, in the mirror, my reflection stood closer, just slightly. Barely noticeable, but closer. The wrongness of it sent a wave of cold down my back. Something ancient, something primal. I knew now, without a doubt, this was not me. It had my face, it had my movements, but I was only watching now. And it was not. I had to break the connection. I had to do it carefully, slowly, I let my fingers curl into my palm, grounding myself. I wasn't going to give in to panic. I wasn't going to let the fear take control. I turned my head by inches, keeping my gaze locked onto my own until the last possible moment. And then I looked away. The silence changed. I couldn't explain how. I couldn't hear anything new. But I felt it, like the air had shifted, like something was watching from just outside my vision. I forced myself to move. Step by step, backing away from the mirror. My legs felt heavy. My arms tingled. The whole room felt different now. It was the same furniture, the same walls, the same ceiling, but I wasn't entirely sure it was my room anymore. Not completely. I made it to the door, my fingers curling around the handle, the cool metal grounding me. A deep breath, then another. I turned the handle, click. Locked? No, I hadn't locked it. I never locked my bedroom door. I twisted the knob again, harder this time, my heart hammering against my ribs. Still locked. And then, from behind me, from inside the mirror, I heard footsteps. I turned around. I had to. I didn't want to, but I had to. The mirror wasn't just reflecting anymore. It was showing me somewhere else, somewhere deep, somewhere I didn't belong, and inside it, something was walking toward me. Not my reflection, not anymore. Something wearing my face, something that had waited long enough, something that was stepping forward. And this time there was nothing between us. I didn't breathe, didn't move, didn't blink. The thing in the mirror, the thing wearing my face, took another step forward. And this time there was no glass between us. I wanted to tell myself it was still a reflection, that if I moved, it would move, that if I turned, it would turn, but it didn't. It only watched me, its expression shifting, stretching into something that wasn't quite human. And it smiled. The door was still locked behind me. I twisted the handle once more, desperation making my fingers slick with sweat. Nothing, no give, no escape. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air heavy, thick like something unseen was pressing against my skin. Like I was standing at the bottom of an ocean, or inside something else's lungs. The thing took another step. Closer now. I could see the details in its face, the way its eyes were just a little too dark, the way its mouth didn't quite match mine. Like it had studied me, had spent time learning the way my skin stretched over bone, how my lips parted when I breathed, but hadn't gotten it quite right. I realized something then. It wasn't imitating me, it was practicing. A cold wave of horror washed over me. It wants to replace me. The thought was sharp, immediate, and undeniable. It had waited, it had watched. And now, the dream had pulled back just enough, the barriers between worlds thin enough, that it was finally stepping through. And I was in its way. I stepped back, my heel pressing against the door. The thing inched forward, slow, deliberate. It didn't lunge, didn't rush, because it didn't need to, because it knew I had nowhere to go, and worse, somewhere, deep down in the part of me that still felt half-asleep, I knew it too. I had to do something. I had to break this. My fingers twitched at my sides, searching for something solid, something real. And then I remembered the key, the one I had held in the dream, the one that had been pressed into my palm so tightly that I had still felt its imprint even after I woke up. Had I ever really let it go, or had it never really left me? I reached into my pocket, and my fingers closed around cold metal. My breath caught. I pulled it out slowly, feeling the weight of it, the unmistakable shape of the key I was certain had been left behind in the dream. It was still here, still with me, and the moment I wrapped my fingers around it, fully the thing wearing my face stopped moving. A flicker of something passed across its expression, not fear, not anger, something close to recognition. Like it had seen this before, like it knew what the key meant. It didn't smile anymore, didn't tilt its head in that awful, knowing way. Instead it stepped back. I felt my pulse hammer against my ribs, a strange mix of relief and dread sinking into my bones. The key was important. The key was mine, and something about it kept this thing from getting any closer. I looked down at the key, studying its smooth, worn edges, the intricate carvings along its shaft. It was the same as before, but now there was something new, a small engraving along the side, a word barely visible in the dim light. I turned it in my fingers, bringing it closer to read, and when I saw the word, the world tilted, the air rippled, and in the space between heartbeats, I realized what I had to do. The thing in the mirror knew it too. I saw it in its dark, hollow eyes. It took another step back, this time not out of caution, but because it knew the game was almost over, and I was about to win. The key was warm now, almost pulsing against my palm. The letters engraved on its surface were unmistakable, etched so deeply that they seemed to glow beneath the dim light of my room. Exit, not a name, not a command, a destination. The thing in the mirror didn't move anymore. It stood perfectly still, watching me, its head slightly tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I had expected anger, resistance, some final, desperate attempt to take my place, but instead it was waiting. And somehow that was worse. I tightened my grip on the key. The walls around me shivered, like a thin layer of reality had been stretched too tightly, the edges starting to fray. The dream was fighting to hold me in place, or maybe it was preparing to let me go. I took a step forward. The thing in the mirror mirrored me, but not exactly. There was a fraction of hesitation, a slight delay in its movement, like it wasn't fully in control anymore. Like I had taken something back. I turned the key over in my fingers, feeling the weight of it, the undeniable realness of it in my palm. If this was my way out, then I had to find the lock. I scanned the room, nothing. No doors except the one that was still locked behind me. No hidden keyholes, nothing that screamed this is the way. And yet the key still pulsed in my palm, urging me forward. I looked at the mirror, at it, at the place where our reflections should have met perfectly, but didn't. A small misalignment, barely noticeable, like the glass had shifted just enough to reveal that it wasn't reflecting at all anymore. It was a door, and I had the key. I stepped closer, heartbeat pounding in my ears. The air around the mirror thickened, pressing against my skin like I was walking through water. The thing wearing my face didn't step back this time. It just watched. It knew what was coming. I lifted the key, and I pressed it against the glass. The reaction was immediate. The mirror shuddered, rippling like a pond disturbed by a single drop of water. The surface warped, bending outward, then inward, like it was breathing, then a click, soft but final. Like a lock sliding open, and then the glass split apart. Beyond it there was nothing, not darkness, not light, just a space that was empty and infinite at the same time. A space I somehow knew had always been there, had always been waiting. The key was still in my hand, but it no longer pulsed. It had done its job. And now it was up to me. I turned back to the thing in the mirror. It was still watching me, expression unreadable. For the first time, I thought I saw something else in its eyes. Not hunger, not imitation. Something closer to relief. Like this had been inevitable. Like this was always how the dream was meant to end. I took a breath. And then I stepped through. For a moment I felt weightless, like I was falling, like I was floating, like I was being unmade and remade at the same time. And then I opened my eyes. I was in my bed. The sheets were tangled around my legs. The air was still, heavy with the lingering scent of something I couldn't quite place. But I was here. Awake, the room looked the same, felt the same, except the mirror was gone, like it had never been there at all. I sat up slowly, pulse still hammering in my chest. Was it really over? Had I actually escaped? I turned my hand over, expecting to see the key still in my palm. But it was gone, nothing but a faint, lingering warmth on my skin, like a dream that was fading, like something that had finally let me go. Or maybe something I had finally let go of. But as I turned toward my bedroom door, I noticed something else. Something small, something impossible. A single, tiny engraving at the very bottom of the doorframe. Exit, and beneath it a keyhole. I stared at the keyhole. Small, almost hidden in the shadows at the base of my bedroom doorframe. If I hadn't been looking for anything, I might have missed it, but now that I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It was real, just like the key had been, just like the dream had been, and the dream wasn't over. The weight in my hand was sudden. A familiar, warm shape pressed against my palm. I looked down. The key had returned. Smooth metal, deep engravings, that single, undeniable word, exit. My pulse quickened. The dream had let me go. But not all the way. Not yet. I looked at the door. It was my bedroom door. It had always been my bedroom door, hadn't it? I tried to remember when I had last walked through it. Tried to recall the feeling of opening it, stepping into the hallway beyond. But my memory stuttered, slipped. I could see the door, but I couldn't remember using it. A slow, cold realization settled over me. I had woken up, but I hadn't left. This wasn't my bedroom, not really, not yet. I moved toward the door, each step heavy, deliberate. The key pulsed in my grip, guiding me forward. My breath felt shallow, my heartbeat too loud in the quiet. I reached the keyhole, lowered the key, paused, because a thought whispered at the back of my mind. A warning. What if this door wasn't an exit at all? What if it was just another entrance? The dream had never stopped shifting, changing. Walls melting into forests, streets fading into oceans. Nothing had ever been stable. Nothing had ever been real. So what if this was just another layer, another illusion, waiting to pull me deeper? I turned, looking back at my room. It looked normal, the bed, the desk, the faint glow of the clock on my nightstand, but something about it felt hollow. Like a set built to look real, but lacking the weight of reality. Like a memory of a room, rather than the room itself. And the only way to know for sure was to turn the key. I took a slow breath, steeled myself, and slid the key into the lock. Click. The sound was soft, almost gentle, but the effect was immediate. The air rippled. A low, humming vibration rolled through the walls, through the floor, through my skin. The room shuddered, and the door opened. Beyond it, there was light. Not the empty nothingness I had seen in the mirror. Not the twisting, shifting unreality of the dream, but a warm, golden light that felt familiar. I took a step forward, then another, each step lighter than the last, like the weight of the dream was finally slipping away. And then I stepped through. For a moment there was silence, then breath, my breath steady, deep. My heart still beating, my hands solid, my feet touching the cool floor beneath me. And as I lifted my gaze, I saw it. My hallway, my home, reality. The door behind me clicked shut. When I turned, it was just my bedroom door again. No strange keyhole, no markings, just wood and paint, like it had never been different, like the dream had finally let me go. I exhaled a real breath, a waking breath, and then I walked away. The dream is over.